Okay, so what I thought I would do is a quick little video or podcast, just going over some things that we discussed in yesterday's lecture on the performance of gender, just to summarise a bit on what I think the key take-home messages are of that lecture. So I started off by going over the assessment, just reminding you that you've got the annotated bibliography due in week 5, and that Jenny and I would like to get email ideas around what your topic is going to be by the end of next week. So if you can email Jenny and I by next Friday with the topic that you're thinking about doing for the annotated bibliography. So remember, you can choose anything in relation to the workplace as long as it's around the performance of gender, workplace masculinities, or whiteness in the workplace. Okay? So have a think about what you want to do and share your ideas with us, and we can give you some feedback. I also then talked a bit around how difficult it can be in 4th year. So it's a really tough time. You've got your dissertation to do, you've got lots and lots of courses to do, you're probably thinking about where do you go next and what kind of job you're going to get and all of that kind of stuff. So it can be a very difficult year. Personal stuff happens, relationships happen, they break up, people get sick, they have family bereavements, their job that they've got outside university can pile a lot of pressure on as well. So really make sure that you use the mitigating circumstances scheme that we have at the university if it's relevant for you. And if you've got any issues that are affecting your ability to undertake the work on the contemporary workforce, or you feel are affecting the extent to which you're doing yourself justice in that work, then please drop me an email or come and see me in my office hours, or we can have a Skype or a phone chat. So keep in touch and let me know how you're going on. And as I always say, you never, ever, ever suffer in silence, okay? So I'm here for you if you need anything, and you can just drop me an email and we can most likely sort it out. So the topic of yesterday's lecture was the performance of gender. And if you see me looking down, it's because I've got my iPad with my notes here just to make sure that I'm covering the same material and that it all makes sense. So the aim of yesterday's lecture really was to have a look and see what are the issues that face women in the workforce still. So we talked about things like the gender pay gap, gender stereotyping, horizontal job segregation, and vertical job segregation. So those are important terms for you to remember, and you can have a listen back to the lecture to get the definitions of those. Sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination and marginalisation in the workplace. And really the aim of this lecture was to say, well, can we explain some of that if we start to unpick and unpack what we mean by gender? So in order to understand gender discrimination and the persistence of the gender pay gap, we need to understand what do we actually mean by gender. So we covered the history of where feminists in particular have discussed gender and what they see it to be, and how it's gone from being viewed as the property of an individual over to a social constructivist view, but still maintaining in that second wave feminist social constructivist view that gender is quite fixed, and the gender that you have by the time you're 5 or 6 is likely to stay with you for the rest of your life. Towards more contemporary ideas that gender is fluid, it shifts across the life course. The gender we're assigned at birth might not be the gender that we choose to live in or that we feel we have to live in, and that gender shifts across contexts. So that's really what we were looking at yesterday. So one of the key ideas really is to decouple gender and gender expressions from biological sex. So increasingly, neuroscience and endocrinology is telling us that our idea that gender and sex are a binary, that there's men and women and males and females, is not particularly useful, and it doesn't reflect reality. So we have to move away from gender essentialism and biological determinism towards a more inclusive, fluid, flexible idea of gender. So the first 2 key theorists that we looked at were West and Zimmerman. And remember, I said this is a paper that you really must read. It's their paper, Doing Gender. It's a key piece of research on gender in the workplace. And for West and Zimmerman, Doing Gender, they view gender as an accomplishment. So gender doesn't come from within us, doesn't come from inside of us, it doesn't come from in here. It's what we do. It's how we dress, it's how we think, it's how we act, it's how we behave, it's how we use language. All of those things are doing gender. So in the lecture, we discussed what some of those things might look like, and some of your ideas included household division of labour, what kind of drinks people might order in a bar, the uniforms that people wear. There's all sorts of ways that we can think about how we do gender. So we looked at a couple of pieces of research. The first one was looking at women in STEM. So I encourage you to go back at that one and look at how women did gender in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And then the second paper was looking at the police force and how women in the US police force did their gender in a way that was quite consciously argued to be biologically essentialist. So, for example, saying that women were more suited to the new caring and service roles of the police force. But also othering other women, particularly lesbian women, that they felt did not meet feminized stereotypes. So there was an idea there that this is how doing gender could be seen. We then moved towards Professor Judith Butler, who really is the key theorist that we looked at yesterday. And as I said, her work is incredibly dense. It's quite difficult to read. Her more up-to-date work actually is a little bit easier to read. So what I did is I put up on Vision a couple of videos about her work, but I would really encourage you to go onto YouTube and Google her, because she speaks much better in a much clearer and easier to understand way than she writes. And actually, if you are reading her work, you might find it helpful to read it out loud and imagine her voice as she's talking. And if you go back to the slides, you'll see that I put a link actually to an interview with Judith Butler where she talks about what she means by gender performativity. So this concept is the one that you will use if you're going to do annotated bibliography on gender performativity. It's Judith Butler's work. So for Judith Butler, we are born into a world where certain gender scripts exist. So there's scripts on how to be male and scripts on how to be female. And those constrain how we're able to perform our gender. So it's not quite as simple as saying we're like actors on a stage and that the gender isn't real or it's not a really deep-rooted identity. But it's similar in the sense of thinking there's a script available to us or a series of scripts. And so the more we perform that script, the more real in a way it becomes. So then we looked at some research by Powell, Abigail Powell, and how she had looked at gender performativity and doing gender, again in male-dominated industries with women. But as I said, one of the limitations of much of this research, or maybe we can think of it more in terms of how this research could be expanded, is we don't know that much about how men do their gender or about how masculinity is performed. Often this research is done on women, primarily because women tend to be more aware of their gender than men, and that'll lead us into next week's lecture on masculinities. And then towards the end of the lecture, the last person we looked at was Pat Yancey Martin, and she talks about gendering practices and practicing gender. So gendering practices are the range of options that we have available to us in order to practice our gender. So we can be like a man or we can be like a woman, but we cannot be both simultaneously. And this is Pat Yancey Martin's position. But remember I said that I wonder if that really is accurate, because increasingly we see the idea of people being fluid with their gender, being non-binary. So maybe we can be both male and female at the same time. Now, whether or not that's accepted by society is, of course, a different question, and it's something we can perhaps explore if you're interested. And then we have practicing gender, which is the literal practices, the actual doing of gender. And that's pretty much where we got to in the lecture. So I think what I'd like you to take away from this and what's important is the idea that gender is not fixed. It's not in our brains. We don't have male and female brains. But it's something that we do or we perform. It's a relationship. So maleness is constructed as a relationship to femaleness and vice versa. So if we think of gender as a relationship, it helps us to think about how it might shift, how it might be challenged, and how we might be able to overcome some of the gender inequalities in the workplace. So next week we're going to look at workplace masculinities. That's a really exciting lecture, and we'll look at actually a bit more of my own research on masculinities. And we'll have a look and see, do all men experience privilege? Well, the spoiler is that no, they don't. Or if they do, it's at different levels. So I hope you'll come along next week. I'm looking forward to seeing you. And please let me know what your ideas are for the coursework. And I'm really looking forward to reading the work that you're going to produce. And I'll see you next week. Bye.